Well, welcome everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us today. This is a follow-on Q&A for Next.js. Cassidy held a great webinar / demo around Next.js a couple of weeks ago, and we had really great reception in that demo. And we had also about 95 questions coming out of that. So we thought it would be very well worth our time to stand up another session today, specifically to answer all your great questions. But before we kick things off, I do have a couple of items to go over before I introduce our speaker. First, the session will be recorded, and we will make the recording available to you after this as well. So secondly, we will be answering questions during the presentation, obviously. So please add your questions using the Q&A widget at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll try to get them as we go along. For those of you just joining, welcome. I'd like to introduce you today's presenter. Cassidy Williams is our principal developer experience engineer at Netlify. And yeah, so I actually, before we kick it over, I wanted to start a fun poll for everyone. So if you could see on your screen, we'd love to get we'd love to learn more about you. So tell us, what's your experience level with Next? What are you looking to build with Next? Feel free to take a few minutes to answer those questions so we can better understand who our audience is and tailor some of these questions to y'all.
Ooh, it's fun seeing all of these responses already. Cool. This will help me a ton to be able to tailor some answers to you folks. So thank you so much for answering those. The last demo was recorded. I'm not sure where the video is, but it was. It's on our YouTube, right, Lisa?
Yes. Yeah, you can, I'm more than happy to send a follow-up with a link to the recording.
Great.
All right, it looks like most folks submitted. I'll give them 10 seconds.
Cool.
All right.
Super interesting to see that.
So it looks like most have some level of experience with Next.js. We have 29% looking to build an app, 22% e-commerce, 20% personal site, and followed by marketing website. So cool. All right. Cassidy, kick it off when you're ready.
Sure, I'll just start, and we've already got some questions coming in. Again, feel free to submit them in the chat or the Q&A widget, and I will answer all of them because there are many of them, or rather, I will answer as many as I can speak, I guess. Anyway, hello. My name is Cassidy. I've been at Netlify for almost a year now, and I do a lot of React and Next.js. This first question that we have is giving a quick overview of the Netlify support for Next.js and how it works. Happy to. A lot of our support actually changed over the past week because we support more and pretty much everything. So long story short, at Netlify, if you want to use Next.js, you can just use it and you don't have to think anything about it. Last week, we actually released an auto-installing plugin. Normally, we have builds plugins where you can install it and it'll add caching, it might add performance metrics, it might add whatever you want depending on the plugin. It's just a JavaScript module. And we have an auto-installing plugin that will make all features of Next.js work. That being said, some features do work better than others, and we can get a little bit into that, but we have full support for preview mode, we have support for internationalized routing, we have support for incremental static regeneration, all of the things we can support it. And so you might see on your site after you deploy it, it might have a little thing saying, hey, heads up, we auto-installed something onto your site. That's what that is. It allows support for the very node-driven aspects of the framework via serverless functions. But overall, you can pretty much use what you want to use in Next.js on Netlify. Okay, how can I use internationalized routing with get static props and get initial props on the same page? I won't get into the technical specifications right now, but long story short, you can. I don't think I have a blog post on that right now, but I can write one up because it's not too bad. With the same page aspect of it, I would kind of want to see what you want to do with it, but the docs are pretty helpful for that. I'm sorry that's not more helpful, but you can. I wouldn't use get static props and get initial props on the same page. I would use I would use just get static props. Get initial props it's not deprecated, but it's not recommended anymore. I would use just get static props and get static paths rather than get initial props. Do you have any advice on how to host multiple names in the same Next.js server? It's almost the same content in each. I was thinking of maybe rewriting the URL client side and pretend the domain was just the route param. So you can have multiple domains pointing to the same thing, and what you could do is in your redirects file, the underscore redirects file, you can do a rewrite. And so you can navigate to a route and you could either redirect to it whenever you hit a certain URL, or you can redirect to it and rewrite the URL. I can pull up the docs on that actually, but that's relatively simple to do. Docs.netlify.com, and let me pull up the redirects, and that's what you'll want to do in there. So I'm going to paste that in the chat. When using next image, should the height and width be the height and width of the original image or larger what you need? So this is my opinion on next image. It works, it gets the job done, but the optimization that is built in for it is typically used for Vercel builds Next.js. And so when they made Next Image, they made it to use their image optimizer. Their image optimizer is just okay. And I'm saying that I'm saying that with all the respect in the world. It's just okay. If you want to do much better image optimization, I wouldn't even use Next Image myself. I would use something like Cloudinary, like ImageX. You can use Cloudinary for very free for pretty much all of your projects. Their commercial ones are paid, but they have a very, very generous free tier. And their image optimization is excellent. I would highly, highly recommend using that instead of Next Image. Next Image works, and we do support it with that plugin that I mentioned before. But again, I personally don't recommend it. Just after building with it and playing with it enough, you don't have to use all the features of the framework just because they exist. If you want internationalized routing, you can use a different library instead of the Next.js one, or you could use the Next.js one. But yeah, anyway, I personally wouldn't use Next Image. The CDN is Cloudinary. Here, I'll pull up a URL for that too, cloudinary.com. It's, again, they have a very, very generous free tier, and we've built quite a few projects internally with it. And I'm actually going to pull up an example of that. We built a learning website internally called Jamstack Explorers, and all of our videos and like adding intros and endings to the videos and all of our images and stuff are hosted with Cloudinary. The site is fully open source and built with Next.js, and so you could see how it works under the hood, or you could just watch our free courses on there as well. You're actually using Strappy, which already uses Cloudinary. Nice, great. Does that mean I should use a plain vanilla image tag with src set? Yes. Okay, next question. We want to use Next for a front-end website that will consume data from a headless CMS. that CMS has a React front end and we want to share some components. Since the admin UI is built using Create React app, can we deploy Next.js site to Netlify out of a monorepo? Yes, you can. We have pretty good monorepo support. That being said, with Next.js, it's kind of built to be an all or nothing thing. You might have some base path problems. Well, that was a hard phrase to say. Base path problems that you might run into with the framework. Just be aware of that, but you should be able to do that relatively simply. And if you set up some good redirects to point across things, that should work just fine. But yeah, I would say you would have a Next.js site, you would have your Create React app with all your components, and then you should be able to import those components into your Next app relatively simply. Okay, let's see. API functionality. Will my API routes work? Yes, they will work. They should all work just fine now. I'm sorry that it didn't work for you a few months ago, but it should work fully now. The difference between Next.js API routes and Netlify serverless functions, they're kind of the same thing. I personally do it in the Netlify serverless functions one just because whenever I build a project, I try to make it as agnostic to the framework as possible. And so they're the exact same syntax, just in a different folder. And so you can use one or the other, whichever you're more comfortable with. I personally just put them in a functions folder at the top level. So if I were to ever change to a different framework, I don't have to change the location of my functions folder. But yeah, they're the same thing. What are the key differences between how the Next.js apps functions in Netlify versus other serverless platforms like Vercel? Could you speak more about the reasons why runtimes aren't the same on both? Is that not open source like the rest of Next.js? Okay, so the way Next.js works on Netlify is we basically make as much of it as static as possible, and that's because when you build it that way where it's static first and then you add the dynamic stuff later, things just go faster for your users in general. And then for features like incremental static regeneration, for features like preview mode, we use serverless functions to add that functionality. Meanwhile, on other platforms, for example, Vercel, they run a full node server at the same time. There are pros and cons to each. I actually have a blog post that might be pretty useful for y'all to read if you want to know why we implement ISR differently. Let me see. It's at cas.run/ISR. I made a URL shortener for myself just so I could reference this blog post. But anyway, if you go to that blog post, it'll explain like there are pros and cons to some of the features and how they implement it. The summary, the high level response is caching. They use a caching strategy that's different than what we would prefer to use. We're coming out with something soon, and I don't know the exact timeline very soon that is going to change how ISR works on Netlify. It won't require any code changes on your part, but it'll result in faster builds and a lot of the functionality you expect without the caching problems. That's truly all I can say right now, though. But that's probably the biggest difference. Yeah. I hope that answers your question. Let me know if it doesn't. Okay, what are best practices to pass full object data from one page to another in Next.js? That you would want to use context. You would use React context around the _app.js in Next.js, and I have a blog post on that too. Let me pull that up. And so one of the things that I don't like about Next, believe me, I like Next. Obviously, I use it plenty. But one of the things I don't like about it is sharing state across routes. Because it was originally a very SSR-driven framework, you can't just share state across 2 pages. You have to share it across all pages. And so the way you would do that is you would create a context that is wrapped around the entire app page. And so I'm putting that into the chat right there. Thanks. I'm glad to hear you're investing more into ISR at Netlify. Yeah, it's going to be cool. I'm geeking out about it because the way we're implementing it will work across frameworks, not just for Next.js. It's very exciting. We got it working on 11D and it was really, really cool to see. But anyway, that's all I can really say about that right now. But anyway, this React context blog post that I put in there should answer that previous question. I need to get parameters from the URL. Therefore, I need to use initial props. Get static props, I need this for internationalization. You can get parameters from the URL using get static paths instead. So get static paths, you can get details, and you can also use the use router hook. And so there's a use router hook that lets you do, I think it has router.use params or get params or something that lets you get the parameters. You don't need to do that in get initial props. Netlify support for Next.js is evolving very rapidly. In recently trying to migrate a simple site from Vercel to Netlify using the auto plugin, we noticed there were some issues and perhaps additional setup was required. For starters, we added the target serverless, but we were wondering what part of the docs are still relevant. Okay, so don't go to the GitHub repo Netlify / next on Netlify. That one is deprecated. The target serverless, that is something that we need to make more prominent. And I'll write, I mentioned that in like my launch blog post and stuff about that. But if you have a next.config.json, we don't touch it because we don't want to accidentally delete some of your lines of code, but you do have to add the target serverless. And that's really the main thing that you have to add. But we do need to improve our docs on that. And so I'm sorry you had that experience, but I'm glad it sounds like you figured it out. Best practices for using dynamic imports. This isn't really Next specific. Import what you need and use it as you need it. And one thing, luckily, that Next.js does is automatic code splitting. And so if you're not actually using it, it'll just remove that from the JavaScript that's running. Does Netlify support routing traffic through static IPs? I don't know. I'm sorry that I can't answer that question. That is something that I would ask that on our answers forum. And that's just answers.netlify.com. I'll drop that in the chat. That sounds like something that's been done before, but I don't know. And I'm sorry, I can't answer that one. We want to use Elastic for search. Is there a best way to build a search UI for Elastic within Next.js? So search could be such a funky thing. I admit I'm not as experienced with Elastic myself, because Next is such a very hybrid framework that touches server-side rendering and client-side rendering and static side generation and stuff. The way that I've done search things in the past and how I plan to continue doing it is making a route where the search results will exist and stuff, and you can add like, it feels very SPA like single page application like, where you can still change the URL and the query params based on what people type. But and so basically doing the client side rendering of search results, and you could call a serverless function or something to query the data that you need, but rendering it all on that one page. That is how I do it, and that is how I would do it. Elastic stuff specifically, I haven't done a lot with that myself. What are some options for using databases with Next.js and Netlify? I personally really like Supabase. We also really like Hasura. Hasura is a really nice GraphQL one. Fauna is pretty good. Your world's your oyster. There's so many database options, but those three are the ones that I recommend the most. I haven't used Next.js for an actual job yet. I'm thinking about styling options. I like style.jsx, but it seems most developers are gravitating towards Tailwind, Chakra, etc. Do you know of anyone actually using style.jsx? Any component libraries or UI kits using it? I'm sorry, but no. It's not that popular. And actually, even the Next.js team that makes Next.js, they actually made style.jsx too. It's nice. I actually use it in some of my projects just because it's built into the framework and it's easy to throw some quick styles in. But a lot of people are gravitating towards the utility first libraries and CSS modules. Those are the ones that are most popular. You still can, of course, but it's not very popular to use that, no. Are logs available when hosting my Next.js app on Netlify? Yes. And yes, and they're accessible on the free tier. There's logs out the wazoo. You can access logs, and one thing that we actually released recently too is linkable log lines, and so you can select multiple lines and send them to your teammates and stuff, so they can look at the logs too. But yes, logs are fully available, and they are available on the free tier. And actually, I can pull up an example for you just so you can check that out. So 1 second, let me pull up one of my projects, and you can see what that might look like. 1 second. Wow, I have way too many projects. Okay, 1 second. This is the one that I want. Okay, let me zoom in and make my page bigger so you can actually see it. I'll zoom in. Okay, so now I'll share my screen really quick so you can see where the logs might go. Okay, that one. So this is a Next.js site that I made. If you want to look at anything, you could go through here, and there's your deploy logs. And so when you click on deploys, these are all the logs that actually happened during the deploys, and it goes through all of that. And then also, if you want to see your functions logs, you go to functions, and then, for example, this one, submission created. I have a function log here, and it'll go through all of those. I don't know why it's actually spinning so much. That's probably my own fault. But anyway, there are plenty of logs. Oh, actually, this is just running. And so if you were to run the function, then you could see the functions now. Anyway, that's where they live, under deploys. So that's where your deploy logs are going, and then there's some functions there. Still some images missing, but we'll look into it further. Ooh, I'm sorry to hear that you have images missing. I have not heard of that problem before. I would love to hear the solution once you come up with it, because that I haven't seen that as much. I just helped someone migrate their site from Netlify from Vercel to Netlify yesterday, and they had the same target serverless thing where they had to change serverless. But besides that, I remember they had to change one of their styling things just because they were using a funky third-party library. But besides that, it just worked. And so if it's not just something's funky. Yeah, strange. Okay. See, can Netlify send logs anywhere like a separate Elastic service? I think there's webhooks for that. I admit I haven't tried sending my logs anywhere, but I'm gonna actually look really quick to see, because that sounds like something that we do, but I'm not sure. So let me just check really quick by scrolling through a couple of things. Let's see, we do send out outgoing notifications when a deploy preview starts, when a deploy preview succeeds, when a deploy fails. We do have deploy settings, different requests. Okay, I'm questioning myself now. It sounds like something we do just because, like, for example, with Netlify forms, you can export that and get different things, but I'm not sure where that could live. But that's something that you should be able to do with JavaScript, right? Like with Node, you should be able to write a script for that. That should be a thing. There's also, let me actually pull up one more thing in the docs that might actually answer what the question for all of us. There was, there's like a trigger on events thing, and I'm going to paste that in the chat. With this trigger on events, there's various triggers where when things happen, a function can run. So this isn't exactly what you were asking for, but it's something where you could potentially run something somewhere. But theoretically, like, you could have a serverless function that's logging things, and then the things that it's logging are sent somewhere else. Like it can be done in a function. Any solution to fuzzy search on MongoDB? I have not used fuzzy search on MongoDB. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Does it make sense to use next image for SVG files? No. SVGs are very good at scaling on their own. I actually was helping someone recently because with next image and with one of the Gatsby plugins that does image optimization, sometimes it actually shrinks the SVG and makes it fuzzy for the users, but only sometimes. It was a very weird problem, but then as soon as you just changed it to an image tag, it worked just fine. I wouldn't use next image for SVG files. Oh, yes, I can repeat the names. And actually, I'll do you one better. I'll put the websites in there. So first of all, there's Hasura, and I'll put that in the chat. Supabase. And then Fauna. I definitely just Googled the word fauna and it pulled up plants instead of a database. There we go. So those are the 3 databases that I mentioned. That's what I see people using a lot, unless they're a really, really big enterprise, then they might be using their own home-rolled solution or something. For Next.js, do people use Tailwind CSS? A lot of people do. The way you would do that is you would import it at the very top level at that _app.js level. And then it'll trickle out to all of the other things. Whenever you want something global, that's where it would live. I personally am not a huge Tailwind fan, mostly because I'm a CSS snob and I like writing my own styles. But sometimes when I do use a more CSS utility, I actually use Bulma most often, just because it feels a little tinier. I like that one. And so anyway, I really like using Bulma. It's very similar to using any of these other ones, where you can just like get your base grid and basic styles in there and then customize it however you want. But yes, you can do that, import it at the top level. It's just a matter of importing it. Do you recommend a solution for flashing fonts after every page reload? Here's my question for you. How are you building your pages? Because if you are building your pages static first, you could build the fonts onto the page and it shouldn't be it shouldn't have any flashing fonts because it'll just load that way. That's probably the best solution I can give you there. Yeah, that would be the solution that I would recommend. Or a smaller font isn't a good solution, but it could work. When you write your own CSS, are you using style.jsx? No, I'm using CSS modules typically. In a lot of my larger projects that are like consulting level projects or for companies and stuff, I typically install something like Bulma or something at the top level, so I have my base styles. And then whenever I need to customize components, I use a CSS module per component. And yeah, that's typically how I do those. Which frameworks do you think work best with Node.js? Pick your poison. I don't know if I have a best answer. It really depends on your use cases and what you're doing. If I try to go as vanilla as possible for a lot of my projects, and so I would just use React or even vanilla JavaScript depending on what I'm building. But if you want to build like a Node.js backend and then a front-end framework on top of that, I mean, you could use Next, Gatsby, Nuxt, 11D, Hugo. I just read an article actually about how Hugo was like the fastest building framework out there, which makes sense because of how it was made. But yeah, it's hard to answer which one is best. Let's see, is there a Netlify CMS example? Yes, there is. I have a couple that I've written on the blog, and I do plan on writing more. 1 second, I have this one for Contentful, I'm gonna copy this link. This one has Contentful, and then there's also this one for Prismic. And so you could look at that one. Not exactly a next question, but how does Netlify see React server components affecting the Jamstack serverless model? It actually fits pretty well. Our founder made a pretty cool demo using React server components, and it was cool because the way he made it, it was a really interesting implementation. I can try to find his repo, but he made it where the server components are built at build time. And it was really fast. It was a really, really cool way of doing it. I don't see it breaking the model at all. It's just a matter of when do you want it to be built, because there's always a server somewhere. It's just, do you want the server at build time or do you want the server at runtime? And when you run the server components at runtime, it's server-side rendering. If you run the server components at build time, it's static first. I'll actually try to find that. I'm gonna find it by searching Twitter. So this is very much a toss-up to see if this will actually work. Let's see. I don't know if I can find it. I'll find it eventually. Oh, look at that, I found it. Okay, 1 second. It's very bare bones, but it's a demo, so you can see how he implemented and what it looks like. Let's see, what are some of these other questions? Which one is more preferred, Next.js or Next.js? Depends on how you use them. There was in that same thing that I was reading before, where Hugo is the fastest. I think it said that Nuxt was the slowest. It was like Nuxt, then Gatsby, then Next were the top 3 slowest, and then everything was much faster. So I guess that answers that, but depends on how you use it. Let's see, does preview mode work? Yes, it does. We use cookie-based redirects to make that work. And so for those who don't know what preview mode is, you might have a CMS where you want to build a static site with Next.js, but you want to preview what that'll look like before making a full deploy preview, waiting for a build, that kind of thing. What you can do is you can trigger an enter preview mode, and it acts like a serverless function. You trigger preview mode, and then that adds a cookie that you're entering preview mode onto the site, and you can redirect to the page, and you can say, okay, this is what the page will look like after I've added a new blog post or changed some content or something. Once you've approved it, you can exit preview mode, then deploy it, and that's how that would work. What are some options for collecting user data from forms on Next? Oh, do I have a solution for you? Netlify forms are amazing. And I say this not because I work here. When I discovered them before working here, it blew my mind. Because what you can do, which is really, really cool, and I'm going to paste this in the chat. What you can do in here is you add data-netlify equals true, and that automatically means that all of your form responses are automatically gathered. And then you can download that as a CSV, or there's a magic serverless function named called like submission created.js. If you make that, it'll automatically run whenever you fill out a form, and it'll just capture it. And I actually have a demo of that. Let me pull that up, and you can see how that one will work. Forms are the bane of my existence. So the fact that you can just add one attribute and it collects things for you is a dream come true for someone like me. Let's see, we did this on Next. I actually mentioned this repo before, but I'm going to pull up a much more specific file. And actually, I'll share my screen again so that way you can all see what I'm talking about. Okay, 1 second, I'll share it. Okay, so in this next adventure site that I made, it's a text adventure game, so it's a lonely code-filled night. And the way it works is it's a story. It's kind of a choose your own adventure you can click through. I actually use an state machine for this. It's kind of interesting. But anyway, you can contribute a character to the story. And so you can fill out this form, and when you hit send on this form, it will trigger a serverless function that will send the form data to a Hasura database. And so if you'd like to see how that works, inside of my repo, I have the character form. And the character form is truly, it's an HTML form and a React component. And then I have this data Netlify is true right here. And if I need to zoom in, I'll do that really quick just in case. This data Netlify is true is the only thing that needed to work to make that, that form be detected by Netlify. Then inside of my functions, I have this submission created.js. So this just runs whenever the user hits submit. And so I get all of the details from the form, just the payload.data. I add the character, and adding the character runs a GraphQL function or GraphQL query that triggers my Hasura database and populates it. And so that is how you can do that with Netlify functions or Netlify forms. I think it is so cool and so nice and easy. It is truly a game changer. Anyway, that is that one. Okay, let's see. We've got some other questions. What is better for an app with different content, some pulled from a database API and functions per logged in user, static or SSR? Again, it depends on how it's supposed to be used, but I would go static first as much as possible because that is a better experience for your users. It's just faster. I'm moving a website from WordPress to Next.js and Netlify. Can you show a redirects example? Yes. Do you want a generic redirects example or do you want just a redirects example? Because here, a very good example of that is actually, I mentioned that I have a URL shortener that I made for myself. And I'm going to paste that in the chat. 1 second. I made this URL shortener for myself. And in here, truly, it's just a redirects file. I also added a package.json so I can run like npm run shorten, and it adds things to the redirects file for me, and I can run that locally. But with Netlify redirects, you have an underscore redirects file. You have the routes that you have and the routes that you want. Or rather, and you put them together and then it automatically makes it. And so you can make your own personal URL shortener that way, but then you can also do that in your Next.js apps and or whatever frameworks you're using. Let's see, can I have some pages using static and others with SSR? Yes, you can. It's just a matter of using get static props or get server side props. Those are your options. Is it possible to make a site that's half static, half? Yeah, that's what I just answered. Half static, half dynamic. Does Netlify support CDN caching as an alternative to ISR? If you look at the blog post that I wrote, and once again, I'll paste it in the chat, cast.run/ISR. We don't support stale while revalidate for reasons. I don't want to get too into it now. Long story short, we don't really like that as a caching strategy, but we do have some caching. There's also some caching builds plugins that you can add to your projects. And we have some cool caching things coming soon that I can't talk about. But read this blog post, it should be helpful for you. Do you have a recommended approach for handling a multi-window paradigms where next pages routes from a single instance may exist in separate processes and JS contexts? I don't know if Next is for you. just based on this question, this may relate to runtime and build time idea. I don't think, yeah, because it doesn't really do that as a single instance. If you made a new video or a new window, I'm sorry, the windows would just have their own separate contexts of everything. I am familiar with Electron where you have the different threads of things and stuff, but I don't think you can do that with Next.js. I'm very curious about your project because that sounds very interesting, but from what I can tell, I don't know if this is the framework for you unless you would have to make some kind of global state management that keeps track of where the user is, and you might have to use get. Okay, this could be possible. You've got me noodling on this now. If you did some kind of session storage or a cookie for the user, then depending on what the user's doing, you could do some kind of context sharing across routes related to the cookie that they're using. And so they could have multiple windows open and the different pages that they're on are affected by that. That's how I would do it. It sounds like a very interesting thing that you're doing, Adam. That's how I would handle that. But I feel like you have to use browser APIs and not a Next.js API for this. Because even if you did like a React context around the underscore app.js or whatever to share state across routes, that only works on that instance. But if you did do something like a cookie or a session storage or something, that would work. But yeah, that's how you would have to do it. It's not built into the framework. What do you use for images in Next.js? I mentioned it already, but I personally use Cloudinary, and I can pull up their website again. They have a very, very nice, generous free tier, and I can pretty much guarantee you will not exceed their free tier unless you have a very large business. Let's see. Would you recommend using Next.js for an e-commerce platform with, let's say, thousands of products and hundreds and thousands per users per month? Yeah. I would say we have an interesting case study that's coming out on our blog soon, actually, that might be really interesting for you to see, where they considered using incremental static regeneration for that, so that way they could have shorter build times. But then they ended up having quite a few bugs on their user end because of the stale while revalidate caching. And so I would say you might want to statically build those pages or server-side render them, but I with Lambda function. But I would statically build those. That the case study, they have like the hundreds of thousands of views per month, and they had, I forgot how many pages, but a lot of pages. And their build times weren't that long. I think it was 4 minutes to build all of the pages statically, and it ended up just being such a game changer for them to build it that way rather than to do it the ISR way. They were just like, we would much rather have a better experience for our users than have to reduce our build time by like a minute or two. But yeah, I would recommend Next for that. Just build it in the right way, so that way you don't run into some of those caching issues that come with things like ISR. Can I layer on a separate CDN on top of Next.js and Netlify? Yes, we have had some customers do that. I don't know which ones I'm allowed to name, but just know some very large companies do that, and so they combine the two to have that type of caching. If we're pre-rendering a page with get static props or get server-side props, can we make subsequent requests from the client side on the same page? Yes, you can. So though you can combine things and do both. Get you a framework that can do both. I keep referencing that Next.js adventure site that I made, but it also does that. And so you can kind of see an example of how that would work. The next adventure, I'm going to pull it up again, and I'll just link to the specific file that I want to show you, and that is under this one. And I'm pasting it in the chat. One second. In this particular page, I'm basically doing some client-side changes and changing the URL route based on those client-side changes. If let's just say you were building a search component, I mentioned this earlier, I would serve up a page and maybe have options and stuff inside of get static props or get server side props, and then do the rest client side. It would make a lot of sense to do that, in my opinion. Best way to store token API auth and secure and next. Environment variables. One thing that you could do where, so with Next.js environment variables, you do like Next.js _public_ and then whatever the name is. And I'm going to type that in the chat because I know that's hard to picture. If you prepend your Next.js public, if you prepend your variables with Next.js _public, whatever, that will expose that that environment variable to the world because it's going to the front end. Otherwise, if you don't prepend that, it won't. It'll be hidden, and you can use Netlify environment variables in the UI and add stuff there. So you can store all of that way and hide things in environment variables, because then it's not exposed to the user. And then if you wanted to do some kind of, I see that you mentioned auth. Auth you can do with a cookie of some kind. You can add a role for your users and do some role-based redirects if you wanted as well. Let's see, more questions. Does Netlify support Next config HTTP rewrites? I think so. This is and I should know the answer to this. It changed